Have you ever had that feeling in your gut that something isn't right, but you push it aside because you want to believe in the person you love? That's exactly what happened to me with my husband, Mark. On the surface, our life looked perfect: a steady marriage, a comfortable home, and a routine that felt safe. But cracks began to appear in the most ordinary moments: suspicious messages, unexplained meetings, and subtle changes in his behavior. I tried to ignore the signs, telling myself I was overreacting, but deep down I knew something was wrong. What I didn't expect was how far his betrayal would go, and how much patience, planning, and quiet observation it would take before justice finally caught up to him. This is my story. I used to think my life was steady, maybe boring, but safe, and I wore that belief like a warm coat. Mark and I had been married 11 years, long enough to stop trying to impress each other and start trusting routine. He worked late at his downtown office, and I told myself that was ambition, not distance. When friends joked about work husbands and office gossip, I laughed and said, "Not my Mark. I believe trust was a choice you made every day, not a feeling you chased." At least that's what I kept telling myself when his schedule changed. He stopped texting on the way home. He started taking calls outside. His phone never left his hand, even at dinner. One night I asked, "Everything okay at work?" He smiled too fast and said, "Just deadlines." I nodded and let it go. Then his cologne changed. It was sharper, expensive, and unfamiliar. I mentioned it casually and he said, "Free sample from the office." I wanted to believe him. I needed to. The first crack showed up doing laundry. I was folding his shirts when a dry cleaning receipt slipped from a pocket. On the back, a woman's name was written in neat handwriting. Not mine. I stared at it longer than I should have. My heart started racing for no reason I could explain. I told myself it was probably the cleaner's name. When Mark came home, I held it up and asked, "Do you know who this is?" He barely glanced and said, "Probably nothing." I pressed, "Nothing like what?" He sighed and said, "You're reading into things." I laughed it off, but the tightness in my chest didn't leave. A week later, his company hosted a casual open house for families. Mark said he'd be in meetings and told me not to bother coming. That alone felt wrong. I went anyway, telling myself I just wanted to be supportive. Standing near the lobby with a paper cup of coffee, I watched employees drift by. Then I saw Mark. He was laughing softly, leaning toward a younger woman with long, dark hair. His body language wasn't professional, it was familiar, intimate. When he noticed me, his smile disappeared. He rushed over and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I came to see you." He introduced the woman quickly. "This is Claire. She works in my department." Claire smiled politely but wouldn't meet my eyes. Mark pulled me away and whispered, "You should go." That night at home, I asked, "Why did you act like that?" He crossed his arms and said, "Because you embarrassed me." I said, "You looked close," he snapped. "She's a coworker." I tried to explain how it made me feel, but he cut me off. "You're being paranoid," he said. "I work hard and now I have to defend myself." I went quiet. He took my silence as victory. I lay awake listening to his breathing, realizing something ugly had started to surface, and I didn't yet know how deep it went. After that night, I stopped asking questions and started watching. I learned that sometimes silence is louder than confrontation, and Mark didn't notice because he believed I was still blind. I watched his patterns closely. When he left for work, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he checked his phone even in the bathroom. I started keeping small notes to myself. Lunch meetings that ran late, texts he left open for minutes too long, the sudden obsession with his work email. One Saturday morning, curiosity and fear pushed me to check our shared laptop. At first, I hesitated. The cursor hovered over the browser history and my hands shook. Then I noticed files labeled private in the trash folder. They hadn't been fully deleted. I clicked on the first one and felt a cold chill. Polite emails, office jokes, confirmations for places I didn't know existed. On the surface, they seemed harmless, but the timing told another story. I began taking screenshots, documenting everything. I watched him walk through the living room pretending to be casual. "Hey, honey, what are you doing?" he asked. I smiled softly and said, "Just catching up on emails." He didn't notice my fingers tapping fast to save proof. Later, he came home, kissed me, and asked about dinner. "Thinking of takeout?" I said yes. He went a shower. I followed up with, "Mark, why do these receipts say Claire?" He froze, water dripping from his hair. "What receipts?" I laid the printed screenshots on the counter. He looked from them to me, then back. It's nothing," he said weakly. I tried to stay calm. "Mark, I need honesty." Now he shook his head. "I'm stressed. Work is insane. Can we not?" I cut him off. "No, look at this. These emails, these receipts, this isn't stress. This is lying." He flinched, then ran a hand through his hair. She's just a coworker, it's nothing." I pressed, "Nothing. You spend late nights with her, you text her constantly, your hotel confirmation emails are in your work account by mistake." Mark, don't lie to me. He backed away. I'm tired, you're overreacting. I'm not cheating, my voice rose slightly. You are, I know it, I have proof. He stared, pale, cornered. It didn't mean anything, he muttered finally. Those words hit like ice water. Nothing, I repeated, my voice quiet but steady. You lied to me for months, you chose her over us for months, and you call it nothing. He looked down, shame flickering. I didn't think you'd find out. I swallowed hard. My chest tightened, but I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply nodded. We'll talk later, I said, my hands folded calmly. He blinked, surprised. Later, he asked. Yes, I said, later. Relief crossed his face like he'd escaped consequences, but I had already decided that this was no longer about forgiveness. This was about truth. About justice. About letting him realize the cost of every lie without me having to say a word more than necessary. That weekend, I kept up the appearance of normalcy. I asked about his work, smiled when he brought flowers home, and made casual conversation. Do you want me to cook tonight? I asked. Sure, that'd be great, he said. I nodded, masking the storm brewing inside me. Every laugh he shared with me felt thin, forced, because I knew the real intimacy had gone elsewhere. I started tracking his office patterns meticulously. Who he met when he went out for coffee, every business trip that wasn't on the calendar. I gathered every scrap of evidence silently. Messages, emails, lunch receipts, hotel confirmations, anything that documented his betrayal. One evening after dinner, I said casually, You've been busy at work. Any big plans? He shook his head, just the usual stuff. I smiled, sounds exhausting. He chuckled nervously. Yeah. But I'll manage. I nodded, keeping my voice even. Good. I like when you manage your life responsibly. Inside, I was preparing to let his own choices catch up to him. I had the evidence. I had the timeline, and I had patience. Waiting became its own weapon. Mark never suspected a thing. He bragged one night over dinner about a new project at work. This could really put me in line for a promotion, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. I sipped mine silently and asked, Do you feel like you deserve it? He laughed, Of course. I've worked hard for years, no one does more than me. I nodded slowly. I'm sure they'll notice. He smiled, leaning back. I'm telling you, I've earned it. Hard work pays off. I let him think I believed him. Little did he know I was about to rewrite the story entirely. Over the next few days, I kept the evidence close, reviewing it carefully. I rehearsed what I would do step by step, making sure there were no mistakes. I realized anger wasn't what I needed, strategy was. Every screenshot, every document, every email became part of a puzzle that would eventually reveal itself. And while Mark continued to act as though nothing had happened, I silently whispered to myself, Karma is watching, and it doesn't miss. Even our conversations became a game. Did you finish the report? I asked one night, glancing at him. Almost, just a few tweaks, he replied. I'm sure you're on top of it, I said lightly. Always, he said and smiled. I returned the smile, but inside I was cataloging every small lie, every omission. Every time he said, I'm busy, I marked it in my mental ledger. Every time he brushed past me with a fake laugh, I wrote it down in my memory. The evidence was building quietly but powerfully, like a dam swelling behind closed doors. Finally, the confrontation I'd been waiting for came one evening. I spread the printed screenshots across the dining table and looked Mark in the eyes. I need you to explain this, I said calmly. He froze. I don't know what to say, he stammered. I held his gaze. Try honesty, he swallowed hard. Okay, Claire and we've been seeing each other. But it didn't mean anything. My heart stopped for a second. Then slowly I said, It didn't mean anything. Mark, you risked everything for her, and that's what you call nothing. He looked away. I didn't think you'd find out. I'm sorry. I nodded, silently acknowledging the truth. Sorry isn't enough, I said. But later we'll talk about consequences. That night he went to bed thinking he'd escaped disaster. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, plotting my next steps. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. The betrayal hurt, yes, but it also gave me focus. I knew what I had to do. And I knew one day Mark would realize that trust isn't something you can lie away. That night, as I turned off the lights, I whispered quietly to myself, Patience. He won't see it coming. From that moment on, I stopped chasing answers. I started building the path to accountability, using the truth as my tool. Every lie he told, every deception he believed would remain hidden was now documented. Every time he smiled, every time he bragged, every time he thought he had escaped, I cataloged it. And all the while, I reminded myself, you can't outrun consequences forever. Little did he know, the hardest part of this story was only beginning. And that night, as I closed the laptop and slid the evidence into a folder marked important, I realized that while Mark thought he had the upper hand, I had something far more powerful, the truth. And truth, I knew, had a way of coming out in ways that no one could stop. The thought brought a quiet shiver down my spine, because the game had begun and the first move had been made. From that moment on, I kept a calm exterior, letting him believe everything was normal. I laughed when he made jokes, I nodded at his stories, and I even praised his work ethic, all while my mind was calculating the perfect moment. I knew I couldn't rush it. I knew patience would make the revelation hit harder, make the justice more complete. Every time he acted smug or confident, I reminded myself that appearances could be deceiving. And deep down, I felt a sense of control I hadn't had in months. Then came the weekend when he left for an overnight business trip. He kissed me goodbye, smiling, and said, "I'll be back by tomorrow night. Don't stay up worrying." I smiled, nodded, and said, "I'll hold down the fort." I watched him leave, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet excitement. Not excitement for revenge itself, but for the moment when the truth would rise, undeniable, unstoppable. I knew that moment was coming, and I couldn't wait to see how he would react when his carefully constructed lies finally met reality. That night, I sat alone with the folder of evidence, reviewing each screenshot, each receipt, each email. I whispered to myself, patience. Wait for it, and as I did, I realized I was no longer the person who had discovered the betrayal. I was someone stronger, sharper, and ready. Mark's hidden affair had set something in motion, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The only question that remained was how long it would take for karma to arrive at our doorstep. I glanced at his empty side of the bed and thought about the words he had said. It didn't mean anything. I smiled faintly. Nothing, I muttered, means everything when you get caught. And with that, I turned off the lights, knowing that the first chapter of this story was closing. And the next one, where the truth would begin to speak, was about to start. The quiet storm was ready to hit, and Mark had no idea it was already forming. By the time I started chapter 3 of this betrayal story, I had learned that silence was more powerful than confrontation. I gave Mark exactly what he expected, a calm, composed wife who pretended nothing was wrong. He came home one evening with a grin, expecting me to ask about work or complain about his lateness. "Hey, honey," he said, tossing his keys on the counter. "Busy day?" I smiled lightly. "Yes, very. How about you?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, you wouldn't believe it. Meetings, emails, coffee breaks, basically my life." I nodded as if I understood. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You're not upset about my hours, are you?" I shook my head. "Of course not," he exhaled like a man relieved to have dodged a bullet. That night, while he drifted off to sleep, I reviewed the evidence I had quietly gathered. Timestamps, receipts, emails, messages, everything pointing toward his affair with Claire. Mark thought he was smart, but office rules were clear. Employees were forbidden from romantic relationships with direct reports or coworkers under their supervision. Claire worked under him. Every late lunch, every shared project, every hotel confirmation accidentally sent to his work account was documented. I double-checked the dates and times, cross-referenced his meetings, and prepared a detailed packet for HR. I didn't include accusations, only facts. I even highlighted policy violations subtly, letting the numbers and messages speak louder than I could. For weeks, I reviewed every piece of evidence, making sure it was airtight. Each morning, I smiled at Mark while he bragged about how well he was handling work stress. I nodded, asked casual questions, and kept him convinced I was oblivious. One Tuesday, Mark told me about the promotion he had been pursuing for months. "This could finally get me where I deserve," he said over dinner, leaning back in his chair. I sipped my tea, replying, "I'm sure your hard work will be noticed." He smiled confidently. "Absolutely, I've put in long hours, I've gone above and beyond." "I deserve this." I nodded and asked, "You think Claire would celebrate with you if you got it?" He laughed, "Probably, but she's just a friend." I kept my face neutral, just a friend. Right, he didn't notice the flicker of doubt in my eyes. That night while he slept, I finalized the HR packet and prepared to send it anonymously. I told myself, let karma do its job. Let truth do its work. The next day, I mailed the packet. A simple envelope, carefully labeled, containing copies of emails, screenshots, expense reports, and hotel confirmations. No names called out, no accusations made, just evidence. I felt a quiet thrill, knowing that Mark would have no idea it came from me, yet it would unravel everything he had built. Later that evening, he came home talking about dinner plans with colleagues. "This project is huge," he said, pouring wine. "It's going to impress management." I nodded, "I'm sure it will." "You've worked hard," he smiled, leaning back. "You really get me." I returned a polite smile, silently counting down the hours until his world shifted. Then the twist arrived faster than I expected. Within a week, Mark was called into a closed-door meeting with HR. The moment he returned home, his face was pale, his usual confident grin replaced by a flicker of panic. "What did I do?" he asked, pacing in the living room. "Nothing," I said calmly. "You just have to answer some questions at work." He stopped, shaking. "Do you know something?" "Did you send something?" I shook my head slowly. Karma has a way of catching up to secrets, Mark. He looked at me incredulous. Secrets I don't understand. I sipped my tea, meeting his gaze. You will soon. Over the next few days, I watched as his demeanor changed. No longer the confident, cocky husband, he became tense and cautious. He kept his phone closer, double-checked his emails, and avoided talking about work at home. Claire, meanwhile, was suddenly transferred to another department. I had anticipated this, but the speed surprised me. It was like the dominoes had fallen all at once. I sat quietly, noting his every reaction, and kept reminding myself to stay composed. There was no joy in his suffering, yet only the heavy, patient satisfaction of justice in motion. Mark tried to regain control. I don't know who's trying to sabotage me, he said one evening, throwing himself onto the couch. I've done everything right, I shrugged gently. Sometimes even doing everything right doesn't save you from consequences. He looked at me sharply. You're not serious, are you? I met his eyes calmly. Serious about what? Life, truth. Karma, he ran a hand over his face. This is ridiculous, I can fix this, I can explain. I shook my head softly. There's nothing to explain anymore. Facts speak louder than excuses. During dinner that night, he tried again. Do you think Claire had anything to do with this? I raised an eyebrow. She's been transferred. Maybe the company wanted a clear workspace. Maybe it's unrelated. You'll have to ask HR. He scoffed. I don't know who could have done this. I took a slow sip of water. Sometimes the person you least expect is just patient. He froze, narrowing his eyes, suspicion creeping into his voice. Are you serious? I smiled faintly. Very. The twist kept unfolding. Mark had applied for a promotion he had been dreaming of, and the timing couldn't have been worse. HR was now reviewing his application carefully, noting discrepancies in expense reports and irregularities in his project logs. I watched from the sidelines, letting the system work, letting truth act as the agent of justice I had prepared. Mark paced at home, muttering to himself, calling colleagues, trying to figure out what went wrong. He didn't know that every step he took was tracked, every move documented, every lie uncovered. I realized at that moment that revenge wasn't about anger. It wasn't about yelling or confrontation. It was about patience, preparation, and letting the truth do the work. I had been the calm observer, the keeper of evidence, the silent force behind the inevitable fallout. Every lie, every late night, every whisper he thought I didn't hear was now in the hands of justice. And Mark had no idea. The following week, I overheard him on the phone. I don't know why HR is questioning everything. I followed all the rules, I don't understand. I smiled quietly, keeping my tone calm when I spoke. Sometimes, Mark, doing the wrong thing makes even following the rules difficult. He looked at me, his voice trembling slightly. Are you trying to scare me? I shook my head. No. Just reminding you that truth has a way of catching up. Mark's confidence crumbled slowly but surely. I watched as he tried to salvage the promotion, only to be told it was under review due to compliance concerns. Claire was gone, transferred quietly to another branch, and Mark realized that his affair hadn't just been a personal betrayal, it had professional consequences. He finally came home one evening and whispered, I don't know how this happened, I'm being punished for what? I met his gaze steadily. For your choices, Mark, for what you did, karma isn't loud. It's precise and it's patient. He sank into the couch, silent. I handed him a glass of water and said, sometimes consequences arrive without warning. And sometimes the person you think you're fooling is the one quietly watching. He didn't respond. I knew he had finally realized the truth. His actions had consequences and there was no one to blame but himself. And in that moment I felt a quiet, steady satisfaction. Not joy, not malice, just the recognition that justice, when prepared carefully, has a way of unfolding perfectly. Mark never suspected me, and that was the real power of patience. The evidence, the timing, the HR packet, it had all been enough. He had brought this storm upon himself, and I was merely the observer making sure it arrived in full force. And as I watched him sit there, staring blankly at the wall, I whispered to myself, patience pays off, Mark. And the truth never sleeps. By the time the week ended, the promotion he had expected was no longer possible. HR had flagged the violations, and upper management had placed him under investigation. Claire was transferred, and Mark's confidence had vanished. The twist, the moment when he realized that his carefully hidden affair had triggered consequences beyond his control, had arrived. I sat quietly in the corner of our living room, sipping tea and letting him wrestle with the reality he had created. And though he tried to act casual during dinner, I could see it in his eyes, the panic, the shame, the dawning realization that nothing would ever be the same. Every lie he had told, every secret he had kept had caught up with him, and I, the silent observer, had orchestrated the only part that mattered, ensuring that truth and justice had the final word. I realized then fully that this wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. There was no screaming, no confrontation, no public humiliation. It was something far more powerful, letting consequences fall naturally, precisely, and completely while he thought he had escaped them. And as I cleaned the table and prepared dessert, I reminded myself that the next chapter would be even more transformative for both of us. The storm had begun, the dominoes were falling, and Mark had no idea how far the consequences would reach. The aftermath of Mark's downfall arrived faster than I had expected, yet with a quiet inevitability that made it feel almost poetic. Within a month, he lost his job entirely. HR cited policy violations, dishonesty, and misuse of company resources, all supported by the documentation I had carefully compiled. I watched from the sidelines as his once commanding confidence crumbled into shaky apologies and defensive explanations. The promotion he had once dreamed of was no longer possible. Claire, the woman he had risked everything for, disappeared from his life the moment stability vanished. She was transferred quietly, her presence erased from the projects and offices she had shared with Mark. I never saw her again, and I imagine she realized, just as he did, that their choices had consequences beyond personal guilt. Mark tried to reach me, pleading, apologizing, promising change. One evening he came to the front door, looking disheveled and desperate. "Please, can we talk?" he asked. I stood at the door, calm, measured, and steady. "Mark," I said gently, "there's nothing left to discuss." He persisted. "I know I made mistakes, I can fix this, please just give me a chance." I shook my head, my voice even. "I've already moved on emotionally, Mark. You need to fix yourself, not me." He looked shocked, the realization hitting him that I had regained control of my life while he was still trapped in the mess he had created. I had filed for divorce quietly, using the same calm tone he once used to lie to me. The settlement was fair, and I walked away with my dignity intact. The quiet satisfaction I felt was different from anything I had expected. It wasn't about revenge in the way movies portray it. I didn't yell, I didn't humiliate, I didn't seek public exposure. Instead, I allowed the truth to stand in place of lies, letting karma and consequence work through the systems Mark had ignored. Every late night, every hidden meeting, every deceitful text had been cataloged and delivered to the hands of accountability, and now I was free. I realized that betrayal doesn't demand rage to be answered. Sometimes, justice arrives silently, and when it does, it's far more lasting than any dramatic confrontation. In the weeks following the divorce, I focused on myself. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, leaning into honesty, self-respect, and a sense of personal freedom I hadn't felt in years. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, explored hobbies I had abandoned, and rediscovered the small joys of daily life. Every time I passed the office where Mark had worked, I felt a strange mixture of relief and empowerment. The man who had once hidden behind lies now faced consequences without me needing to act with anger. The lesson was clear: karma doesn't need help from rage, only time and truth. Mark eventually moved out of our shared neighborhood, taking with him the remnants of the life he had once thought was secure. His reputation followed him faster than he expected, and I never heard from him again. Claire was gone as well, a footnote in a chapter of his life that ended abruptly. And as I walked through my now peaceful home, I reflected on everything that had happened. The sting of betrayal had transformed into clarity. I had learned to trust my instincts, protect my worth, and understand the quiet power of patience. Revenge had not come from shouting or exposing him to others. It had come from letting the truth do its work, allowing the systems and consequences that were already in place to unfold naturally. In a way, it was more satisfying because it required no performance, no anger, and no compromise of my integrity. I had been the calm witness, the steady hand behind the scenes, and in the end, the universe delivered its own justice. I often thought back to the moment when I discovered the dry cleaning receipt, the first small crack in the life I had assumed was safe. That moment had been painful, confusing, and frightening. But it had also been the beginning of my transformation. I realized that betrayal could be a teacher if approached with clarity and patience. I had allowed it to teach me resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional independence, and for that I was grateful. The moral of this story, I discovered, is simple: trust your instincts, protect your worth, and never underestimate the power of truth. Betrayal hurts, but it does not have to destroy you. Sometimes the quietest responses, the ones rooted in patience, observation, and thoughtful action, create the most powerful outcomes. Mark's choices cost him dearly, but they also taught me the value of calm strength and moral clarity. And as I continued my life, free from the shadow of his deceit, I knew that I had grown stronger, wiser, and more in control of my own happiness than I had ever been before. Looking back, I understood that the worst pain often comes with the greatest lessons. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had also reclaimed myself. The chaos of Mark's actions had forced me to recognize my own strength, my own clarity, and my ability to navigate life with integrity. And in that recognition, I found freedom, peace, and a renewed sense of self. The storm had passed, the dominoes had fallen, and the quiet justice of truth had prevailed. From that point on, I carried the lesson with me in every decision, every relationship, and every challenge. Life would continue, inevitably presenting its ups and downs, but I knew that patience, truth, and self-respect were more powerful than any deception or betrayal. Karma, I realized, doesn't need a voice. It only needs time and the willingness to let consequences fall where they belong. Mark's story ended with his choices, while mine continued with my freedom, dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that integrity always wins. And as I moved forward, I promised myself I would never allow anyone to undervalue me again, never let lies take root in my life, and never forget the quiet, unstoppable power of truth. The final chapter of Mark's betrayal had been written, and I was the author of my own renewed life. Peace, I discovered, is often the most potent revenge, and freedom the sweetest reward of all. Looking back, I realized that betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. It can teach you strength, patience, and clarity. Mark's choices cost him more than he ever imagined, but they also showed me the power of quiet justice. Revenge isn't about yelling, public humiliation, or losing yourself in anger. It's about letting truth and consequences take their natural course. I walked away with dignity, learned to trust my instincts, and rebuilt my life on honesty and self-respect. Karma has its way of balancing the scales, and sometimes the quietest response can be the most powerful. Never underestimate the power of patience, truth, and self-worth.